The woman I trusted most turned into the biggest betrayer of my life. I used to think houses told the truth about the people who live inside them. That's what I loved about being an architect, the way light falls through a clerestory window at 4 p.m., the way a banister absorbs the oils of a family's hands until it becomes a shine, the way a foundation, properly poured, stays unbothered by time. A house doesn't lie, people do. That was the thought in my head at 11:50 p.m. 2 minutes after, I opened an email from my wife that said, as casually as a note about groceries, "I've moved your inheritance into my personal account. It's better this way." No greeting, no miles, no signature. Just a sentence that took a hammer to the joists under my life. My name is Miles Hartley. I'm 44, and I've lived most of my adult life in Savannah, where the oaks fling their arms across the streets and the air smells like river water and old wood. I was in my home office, the one I designed as a thesis on restraint walnut desk, matte black desk lamp, a shelf of model buildings I'd made in grad school when I read Kendra's email. Attached was a blurry phone photo balcony rails, sunset melting orange into purple, 2 glasses of wine beading with sweat, and a bearded man with his body turned toward my wife like a plant following light. Kendra's smile in that picture wasn't one I'd seen in years. It was looser, unbuttoned, a private smile she'd forgotten to keep private. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen because kitchens are where people go when they don't know what to do next. I filled the glass with water and stood at the back door looking out at the yard we'd redesigned 3 summers ago like it had been a rehearsal for the life we meant to keep. I'd laid the stone path in a crescent that frames the hydrangeas Kendra chose. Blue as July, I remembered the heat of that weekend. Her laughing that my shirt was so soaked I could wring it out and make a new river. We'd argued that day about curve versus straight line. She wanted playful. I wanted formal, and the compromise became a shape we called ours. I drank the water down to ice. I waited for the spike of panic or the choke of rage. Neither came. Something else did, a heavy clarity, like an iron weight settling on a scale and finally bringing the needle to zero. I didn't need to ask whether the message was a joke. The month had already taught me the language of what happens in a marriage before the posters peel off the wall, retreats that last longer, phones that sleep face down, passwords that change, sentences that end sooner than they begin. 3 months earlier, Kendra had asked about the inheritance for the first time with what looked like politeness and was actually a probe. Where exactly is it held? Which bank? Shouldn't we diversify? It's silly to keep large amounts in one institution. I'd said I was thinking about it. I had been just not the way she meant. The money wasn't just money. It was Aunt Elaine nursed through 2 recessions. The woman who took me in after my parents' wreck when I was 14 and taught me that steadiness is a kind of love. She died the previous spring. Cancer, mean, efficient. She left me $587,000 and a note in her handwriting that always leaned forward. Build something that lasts. At the time I thought something meant a building, maybe a mentorship program. I didn't know it meant me. Kendra was supposed to be at a yoga retreat in Arizona. The timestamp on the email said 11:22 p.m. her time. I waited for a second email, a text, a call, an apology without the apology words. Nothing. When your spouse has already crossed a border, they become quiet about the country they're leaving. I opened my laptop again and replied with 6 words that were a bridge I had no intention of crossing. Thanks for letting me know. I sent it and closed the lid as if that closed something else. That night I slept like people sleep after declarations are made. Not deeply, not happily, just without the small jolts. I woke at 6, made coffee, and told myself the first honest thing I'd said in months. You have known this was coming. Not the method, not the email with its curt theft, but the movement of it, the tectonic slide underneath household talk, the way Kendra had become a traveler in her own home. The retreat luggage lived half-packed in the guest room. Her toothbrush in our bathroom always looked like it had been set there for staging instead of use. We met 15 years ago in Charlotte at a conference that was supposed to be about sustainable materials and turned into everything else. She was building a wellness brand tea blends with names like Stillness and Lemon River, body oils that claimed to be good at teaching calm. She'd asked if I could design her first brick and mortar. I was 5 years into my career and tired of logic only parking structures. HVAC calculations, budgets. I wanted a thing I could point to and say, this is what a person feels inside it. We went for coffee, then dinner, then the kind of walk where two strangers talk like they've already forgiven each other for what they haven't done yet. We married in 3 years. We moved into the Craftsman on Victory Drive with a wraparound porch that made Kendra sigh every time she turned the key. We didn't have kids her choice first, then mine to honor her choice. The business is my baby, she said. And I said that made sense. What I didn't say was that my buildings were mine, too, and that our lives could hold both. For 8 years, we did what dual career couples do. We traveled when we could, hosted dinners with playlists and candles, pretended barbecue smoke was a personality trait, bought rugs we couldn't afford because a floor without a rug felt like a sentence without a verb. We were decent to each other. That was our brand. Then Aunt Elaine got sick, and the hospital's clock became our clock. I drove to Atlanta on Mondays and slept on the vinyl pull-out chair in her room. I watched the monitors, the drip, the numbers people learn to read like weather reports. Kendra came twice in 6 months. She said hospitals depressed her. I told her I understood, even though I didn't, not really. I tucked the disappointment away like you tuck the corner of a sheet under a mattress, so tight you forget the wrinkle is there. When Elaine died, there was a will. And I learned about the trust she'd set up with the kind of careful money that comes from never having had any. She had made it irrevocable, a word that becomes a fortress if you keep the gate closed. Rita Wallace, her attorney, explained the structure distributions, protections, limits. I nodded like a man being told how the airbags had saved his life after the crash was over. Kendra seemed sincerely surprised, and after that, sincerely interested. Her ideas came the way rain comes to Savannah, not a sprinkle, but a sheet. We should open 3 more retreat locations, she said over dinner one night. We're leaving money on the table. I asked. She smiled, took the question as a joke, sipped her wine. Yes, a family. I need to think about what Elaine would have wanted, I said. And that was when I noticed the first hairline crack in the wall I'd painted smooth and called marriage. After that, I watched the pattern. Retreats multiplied from occasional to frequent. The phone spent more time face down. The cushion of our talk deflated by a fraction each day. There were new passwords. She said we less and I more. When I moved toward money topics, she changed the subject like a magician misdirecting a hand. Then, one afternoon, Frank from next door, retired postal worker, enemy of high grass, brought a loaf of his wife's sourdough and a piece of information I pretended to hear as if it were as casual as the bread. Saw someone drop Kendra off last week. He said, late, tall guy with a beard. I was out back. Grey Tesla, sleek as a cat. I was in Boston, I said, mostly to myself. Must have been, he said. He asked about a deck repair. I thanked him for the loaf. When he left, I put the bread on the counter, cut a slice, buttered it, and took one bite that tasted like certainties slipping. That night, Jerry, my firm's financial advisor, called. He's one of those men who speaks in sentences so shaved of excess they feel like polished stones. Someone tried to access your trust accounts. He said, failed security questions. The last four of your social were used. We flagged it. I listened, thanked him, took notes I didn't need. After we hung up, I went to the backyard and found Kendra on the phone near the hydrangeas. Her voice low and bright, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in a long time. When she saw me, she said, "Just Patricia from the studio," which would have been fine if Patricia hadn't left the business 8 months earlier. I didn't accuse. I didn't say the name was the wrong one. I watched her top off her wine and walk past me without looking closely enough to see that something had already ended. 2 weeks later, she packed for Arizona. Sedona or maybe Scottsdale. It was always one of those thin air names. She kissed me with the absence of pressure a person uses when they don't want to leave a mark and said, "I might extend this one." "Really dive deep. I'll hold down the fort," I said, and if there was bitterness in the sentence, it hid behind the commas. When the door shut, I did not go to her phone or her email. I went to our shared cloud folder, the one labeled Home Renovation Ideas. You could call that snooping if you wanted. I call it what an architect does when he suspects rot in the subfloor. He opens the hatch and looks inside. Among PDFs of kitchen islands and paint swatches were screenshots of my accounts, clipped with the care of a project manager. There was a photo of a whiteboard with my inheritance written as a top-line number and a minus 20% next to the phrase, "Transfer fee explanation." A note that looked like planning, not speculation. There were copies of statements with post-it yellow highlights around routing numbers and reminder arrows pointing toward dates. I closed the folder and sat in the guest room on the edge of the bed where Kendra's half-packed suitcase was always auditioning for travel. The feeling wasn't fury. It was straightness, a line running forward with no curves left in it. I called Rita and asked for a meeting in Atlanta the next day. I drove up before dawn, drank 2 coffees by the time I reached the county line, and walked into her office with a list. She listened, hands folded. The way people who have heard a lot of bad news learn to hold their fingers. Your aunt was wise to use an irrevocable trust. She said, "The funds are protected provided you haven't commingled them with marital assets. Based on what you're telling me and what I see, you haven't." "What do?" I asked. "Document everything," she said. "I'll notify the trust company to monitor and log all access attempts. If someone tries to move funds, they'll be blocked and we'll have evidence." Driving back to Savannah, I watched the pines stack like columns along the highway and thought of buildings that fail. The news always calls it collapse. An architect learns to say progressive failure. One thing gives. Load transfers. Another thing gives. Until something stops or nothing does. I told myself, you are going to stop this the right way. 5 days later, at 11:22 p.m. Arizona time, Kendra sent the email she must have believed was a trumpet blast. I replied with a 6-word muted trumpet and slept the best sleep I'd had in months. The next morning, I showered, shaved, ate toast I didn't taste, and began the part of the job I was built for, making a plan. At 9 a.m., I forwarded the email to Rita and Jerry with the subject line that said, "Documentation requested." At 9:12, I called Thomas Webb, a divorce attorney Rita had mentioned once as a name worth keeping on a piece of paper in your wallet. His secretary put me on the calendar for that afternoon at noon. Kendra texted, "Did you get my email?" I wrote, "Yes." She sent back, "That's all you have to say." I let the dots blink and then go still. I sat in Thomas's office at 2 with Rita on video. Thomas is in his 50s and wears ties like punctuation clean. Definitive. He paged through the packet. Rita had already emailed screenshots from the folder. Attempted access logs, the bearded man's photo, the trust papers, a printout of the email with its 7 words of betrayal. "This is financial misconduct," he said, as if diagnosing a patient. "In Georgia. That matters. We filed today. Do it." I said. I signed where he told me to sign. It wasn't adrenaline. It was paperwork. It was the comfort of form after shapelessness. At 4:30 p.m., Kendra finally called. Her voice on my screen was a familiar noun that had turned into a strange verb. "You're being childish," she said. "No greeting, no, how are you? This doesn't have to be difficult." "I agree," I said. "It doesn't, it. The money is already moved," she said. As if facts were like chairs you could just put somewhere else. "Fighting it will just drain more through legal fees." "Where are you staying?" I asked. "What does that matter?" "Just curious where home is now." "Miles, focus. We need to discuss the financial arrangements. I'm having my lawyer, David Lawrence, draw up settlement papers. It's better for both of us to keep this clean." I wrote the name down. "That's helpful," I said. "Are you listening?" she asked. "This doesn't have to be." "You said that already," I said. "I appreciate your concern for making it easy." There was a pause while she recalibrated her tone to match the new weather. "It's for the best," she said. "We've been moving in different directions for years." "You're right," I said. "Cleaner is better." After we hung up, I called Thomas back, gave him David Lawrence's information, and considered the geometry of a conversation in which someone thinks they are telling you where the lines go and you are measuring instead. At 6 p.m., Rita called. "We recorded 3 separate attempts today to initiate transfers from the trust accounts. All blocked, all logged. IP addresses show Scottsdale. We also found suspicious activity last month and export of account details while logged into your home network." "Thank you," I said, and meant it the way a man thanks a guardrail after a skid. That night, I opened the bottle of 20-year scotch we'd been saving for our 15th anniversary. I poured 2 fingers into one glass and stood at the kitchen window. I thought of Jason. I didn't know his name yet. Only his beard and the way his body tilted toward Kendra in that balcony photo. I wasn't jealous. Jealousy is a fever, and I didn't have a fever. I had a list. The next morning, David Lawrence called. "Mr. Hartley," he said with a tone that tried not to sound like an apology, "still in the future. I represent your wife. She indicates you're amenable to a straightforward settlement." "Is that accurate?" "It depends," I said, "on what straightforward means." "She's provided statements and will send transfer confirmations," he said carefully. Like a man carrying a cake down a staircase he didn't trust. "Has she also provided the part where the trust structure makes her claim impossible?" I asked. Silence. "Then I'm not aware of that." "My attorney will send the documentation," I said. After I hung up, I drove to Brightstone Bank, the one that had our mortgage and the joint checking we used for bills and groceries, and the place where habits become proof. Harold, the branch manager, remembered my name and the deck we'd refinanced 2 summers ago. I asked to see activity on all joint accounts. He turned the monitor toward me and paled like a man realizing the weather report was wrong. There were transfers I didn't recognize. Small at first, 2,500 the numbers you could hide in a calendar. Then 47,000 2 weeks ago. The destination account wasn't Brightstone. It was Northern Lakes Credit Union. The address on the account was an apartment in Scottsdale. "Print it all," I said. When I got back to Thomas's office, the paper was warm in my hands. He looked at the totals. $178,250 siphoned out of joint accounts over the past 8 months, as if siphoning were a wellness practice. "She's been building a new life for a while," Thomas said, while still drawing from mine. I said. Thomas's assistant buzzed David Lawrence on the line. Urgent. We listened to a voice that had lost its confidence. "I've received the trust documentation," Lawrence said. "My client may have misrepresented certain aspects of the financial situation. I believe it would be beneficial for all parties to discuss a revised approach. He'll drop her by end of day," Thomas said after the call. "No one wants to be the lawyer who walked into a buzzsaw. What about the money from the joint accounts? I asked. We add it to the filing, he said. We lay out everything, the Scottsdale address, the external account, the witness who saw the man with the grey Tesla, the cloud folder with your accounts clipped like coupons. Let her explain to a judge why she did that while married to you. I nodded and felt something I hadn't felt since the day of the car crash that killed my parents. The sense that life had just pivoted and that my job wasn't to return to the before but to build the after. One more thing, I said. I need to know who he is. Thomas met my eyes and did not ask why, because the why is understood between men who have seen structures fail. He said he'd have someone look. That evening, a courier rang my bell with an envelope. David Lawrence formally withdrawing as Kendra's counsel. Attached was a note from Thomas' first domino. 30 minutes later, Kendra called 3 times. I let each call go to voicemail. Then a text, "What the hell did you do? I made a sandwich, ate it, and sent nothing." Rita emailed a report the trust company had completed their investigation. Documented multiple unauthorized attempts over 3 months. Captured IP addresses, timestamps, devices, the kind of file that makes prosecutors interested. "No action required from you at this time," she wrote, which is a sentence that feels like a blanket. At 9:07 p.m., Kendra texted, "We need to talk now." I replied. "Through your new attorney," she wrote back, "you've completely overreacted." I was angry when I sent that email. I didn't actually move anything. I typed, "That's not what the access logs show." A pause. "What access logs?" she wrote. I ignored the question and sent, "Who is he?" 20 minutes. "This isn't about him," she said. Name I wrote. Another 15. Jason Berkeley. He's just a friend with a balcony and a body that leaned toward her like a sunflower. I looked him up. LinkedIn said former investment broker turned yoga instructor. I could see the pitch now. Abundance meets mindfulness. He taught a class called Stillness in Motion at a Scottsdale studio that sold tank tops with the word breathe arranged in circles. The next morning, I walked to Frank's porch with the printed photo of the man from the email. "This him?" I asked. He squinted. "Yeah." He said, "Tall, beard, grey Tesla. He came by 5 or 6 times while you were out of town." He agreed to write a statement without my asking. Some people understand the word neighbor as a verb. At 11 a.m., Thomas called. "Complication," he said. And I could hear that he didn't mean problem so much as the expected escalation. Kendra had hired Philip Barnes, an attorney whose reputation was expensive and effective. Barnes had requested an emergency hearing to contest the financial misconduct claim. He says his client has evidence that all financial decisions were discussed and agreed upon, Thomas said. Deadpan when I asked, "Monday morning, 3 days. Then let's give him something to read," I said. We overnighted a package to Barnes's office, the log report, the Northern Lakes transfers, the Scottsdale lease, Frank's notarized statement, and screenshots from the home renovation folder where Kendra had built her heist storyboard. At 5 p.m., Barnes asked for an urgent meeting to discuss settlement options. He offered a clean split of remaining marital assets. She keeps what she already took, no claims on the inheritance, no spectacle, counter. I said, she returns half of what she took from the joint accounts and signs an NDA. I won't pursue fraud. You could get more. Thomas said, I don't want more. I said, I want done. On what would have been the hearing morning, Kendra arrived at the courthouse with Barnes and the face of someone who had run out of rehearsed lines. Thomas handed over the evidence file. I watched from behind glass as her expression moved through defiance, confusion, fear, and finally defeat. Barnes leaned in and said something that looked like math. 10 minutes later, he came in and said, "My client accepts the terms." We signed in a room that smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. When it was over, I handed Kendra an envelope. What's this? She asked. Passwords, I said. Cloud storage, house alarm. Anything you'll need to get what you left behind. She looked for anger in my face and saw empty fields where anger had once lived. She left without turning. When the door clicked closed, Thomas exhaled. You just architected the cleanest divorce I've seen from a situation that begged for war. He said. I nodded. War takes time, I said. I have buildings to design. 6 months later, I sold the house. The wraparound porch was never built for one person to walk around and around. A young couple with twins bought it. The hydrangeas were a color I refused to rename. I moved into a downtown loft where the walls were brick and the windows tall and the furniture didn't have to remember anything. I asked Rita to help me restructure Auntie Elaine's inheritance into a foundation for architectural scholarships for kids who had lost parents. The first recipient was a 17-year-old from South Georgia who wrote about designing healing spaces as if buildings could be salves. Elaine would have loved her, Rita said, and I believed it so hard my chest hurt. One afternoon, in the lobby of my building, there was an envelope with no return address. Inside, a cashier's check for $89,275 and a note in a handwriting I wouldn't have recognized if not for the way the K leaned too far left. The rest of what I owed, not just the money. No signature. It didn't need one. I took the long way to the river. The bulk carriers leaned slow against the current the way tired animals lean. I sat on a bench where Kendra and I once decided to open a joint venture, a wellness space I would design. She would operate. That dream had died in one of those quiet ways dreams die not with a bang, but with different calendar invites. My phone buzzed. Jerry dinner still on for 7. Bringing that architect I mentioned. I looked at my watch. Time to go home. Change. Walk toward a different kind of evening, the kind where your heart is available to its own weather. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't to burn anything down. Sometimes it's to find a plot of ground, clear the debris, and lay a new foundation with the steadiness your aunt believed you owned. Sometimes the best revenge is proving to yourself you never needed it. I stood, texted back, and headed into the light that was folding itself into the edges of buildings I had not yet designed a week before I sold the house. Frank knocked on my door with a six-pack and the kind of look men use when they want to ask a question without making the question the point. You all right? He asked. I am, I said, and surprised myself with how true it was. He sat at the island, cracked open a bottle, and told me about his first marriage, the way a man who used to sort letters for a living tells stories chronological. Stamped. She wanted a different life. He said, sometimes that life includes a different person. Sometimes it includes your money. I didn't have what you have. I had a checking account, a savings account, and a whole lot of trust that had never been tested. Trust feels like aesthetic until it doesn't, I said. He grunted. Trust is a load-bearing wall, he said. When it fails, everything moves. If you've never had someone try to move your money away from you while you are still standing in the house, let me explain what it looks like from the inside. It's not a single click and then empty vaults. It's a series reconnaissance, rehearsal, small withdrawals that learn the shape of the system, an attempted big pull when the math says the odds favor the thief. The reconnaissance was Kendra's questions about the inheritance months earlier and her screenshots in the home folder. The rehearsal was the unauthorized access attempts that the trust company blocked and logged. The small withdrawals were the 2K and 3.5K transfers no one would blink at if the month had been expensive. The big pull was the 47K transfer 2 weeks before the email. A test to see whether the line could hold weight. When that worked, she sent the email to try to knock me off balance noise to cover motion. Here's the most important thing I learned in those months, and if you're watching this as a cautionary tale, and I hope you will write this on a card and stick it on your fridge. Systems protect you when feelings cannot. Love is not a security protocol. Marriage is not a firewall. Documentation is a kindness to the future version of you who will need to point to something other than a story. When I met with Rita the second time to formalize the foundation, she asked if I wanted to press charges. It's viable, she said. The attempted access to trust funds, the misrepresentation to Counsel Barnes won't touch her again, but a prosecutor might. I know, I said. But I remember how long trials take. I've designed buildings quicker than cases resolve. I don't want to spend my 40s in a courthouse. You're allowed to be merciful, she said. I don't think it's mercy, I said. It's design. I'm designing my life to be something other than a defense exhibit. I met Jason once, years later, in a place I didn't expect him, the lobby of a boutique hotel where a client had put me up for a ribbon cutting. He was checking in. He still had the beard. He still looked like abundance had a body. He glanced at me, glanced away, and then glanced back like a man who felt a draft from a door he hadn't meant to open. You're Miles, he said, and hearing my name from him was like hearing it read from a file. I am, I said. He smiled like a yoga teacher about to say, honor your practice. I've wanted to apologize, he said. Things got confused. I considered telling him that the words sorry and confused are often used as plaster on the wall instead of as sandpaper that one covers. The other refines. Instead, I used the sentence I had rehearsed in case this ever happened. I hope your life is what you wanted it to be, I said. He blinked. It was both permission and indictment, and he couldn't tell which. A bellman touched his elbow and he turned. I walked past him and into the street where the air smelled like rain on concrete and new paint. What mattered wasn't that a man with a LinkedIn that used to list broker and now listed teacher had tried to reorganize my life to suit his. What mattered was that I had built a design that could not be reorganized without my say-so. Irrevocable is a word I used to think meant unyielding. Now I think it means promises kept to yourself, to the people who loved you enough to leave you the means to do something good. The first scholarship ceremony felt like a housewarming for a home that had no walls. The girl from South Georgia wore a blue dress the exact color of our old hydrangeas. She shook my hand and said, "My mom says buildings don't change people, but I tell her people don't change unless they have a place to change in." She laughed, embarrassed. That sounds better in my head. It sounds perfect out loud, I said, and thought of Aunt Elaine in her nurse's scrubs humming under her breath as she set out pills and a glass of water and her kind of order. That night I walked to the river again and watched a barge drift with a stubborn grace that isn't the same as ease. Rebuilding is not ease. It is work. It is choosing where to put your weight after the floor gives way. It is deciding which doors you will no longer open. It is saying no without a story and yes without a speech. I tell you all this not because I think my way is the only way. It isn't. Some people need courtrooms. Some need forgiveness speeches under string lights. Some need to paint the kitchen at 2 in the morning and then sit on the floor and cry until the paint has skinned over enough to not show the water. My way was documents and design and a promise to a woman who wrote, "Build something that lasts," and meant it like a blessing. So here are the only instructions I'm arrogant enough to offer. Keep inheritances separate if you want them to stay what they are. Not because you don't love, but because you do. Don't commingle funds without eyes open and paper signed. Romance can live in a house built with clear agreements. Watch for patterns, not moments. Moments are noise. Patterns are music. Document now. You will never regret having too much proof when you need it. Ask for help. Lawyers aren't just for fights. They're for design. And then, when it's over, whatever it is for you, decide to do something that replaces hurt with structure. A scholarship, a mentorship, a playground pavilion in a neighborhood that needs shade. Your healing needs a shape. The last thing I will say in this part of the story is about the house I sold. On closing day, the twins, a boy and a girl, ran the length of the wraparound porch, yelling at each other to come look at the miracle of a porch being long. The boy stopped at the hydrangeas with his hands on his knees, like a runner finishing a race, and said, "These look like scoops of sky." His mother laughed and said, "That's not how sky works," and then looked at me and said, "We're going to be happy here." "Good," I said. That's what it was for. I walked to my car and didn't cry, and then did in the Publix parking lot when an old song came on the radio without my permission. There is no shame in crying between produce and the cart corral. It means you're a person who kept the part of your life that feels despite the part that decides. Back downtown, my loft windows caught the last pink of the day like paint you can't buy. I sat on the floor with takeout and sketched a building I'll probably never get to build along. Low structure with a porch that wraps and rooms that never lock and a kitchen big enough to hold everyone who comes home late and brings sorrow like luggage. The plan had a garden with a path in a curve, because for once I wanted to lose the argument on purpose. Jerry is a quiet man until he isn't. When he texted about dinner, he added, bringing that architect I mentioned, he meant Evelyn. He'd said her name once in a voice like he was trying not to put weight on it. She ran a small firm that did public projects, libraries, clinics, schools, the kind of buildings that remember every face that walks through them. I was early because I am always early to places where I don't know who I'll be when I leave. The restaurant had wood tables that had been sanded down by generations of cutlery. The waitress poured water and asked if I wanted bread. I said yes because saying yes to bread is a way to practice saying yes to everything else. Jerry arrived with Evelyn on his left. She was in her late 30s, hair clipped up, a dress the color of wet clay. She shook my hand like we were colleagues who had both just come in from the rain. We talked about the Savannah heat and how it makes architects think about shade more than sun. About the way public buildings used to sit in the center of towns like cathedrals and now sometimes hide behind parking lots. Jerry told the story of when the chiller blew at our office and I had a contractor on the roof with a headlamp at 3 a.m. Miles doesn't panic, he said to Evelyn like he was making a handoff. He lists. Evelyn smiled. Lists are how we bargain with panic, she said. I make them too. They usually end with buy yogurt and call city engineer. We didn't talk about marriages or emails or men with beards. We talked about brick coursing and the way school cafeterias sound on pizza day and whether glass boxes have finally worn out their welcome. I realized at some point in the second course that I had decided to like her. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was a load path wait traveling through the right sequence of members to land safely. After dinner, Jerry said a too easy goodnight and left us on the sidewalk where the evening was doing that Savannah thing of being thick and tender at the same time. Evelyn looked at my shoes and said, "You're a Brooks man." And I laughed like I hadn't laughed in a while. "What gave it away, architect walk," she said. "You can turn a corner without scuffing." We walked 2 blocks and stopped outside my building. "This is me," I said. "Well, on the 4th floor." "This is me," she said, pointing across the street to a brick building with a dental office on the ground floor. "Well, 3rd. "What are the odds?" I asked. "Higher if Jerry plans it," she said. We both looked up at the facades like we were seeing elevations in a drawing set. "Want to see the model library I'm working on?" she asked suddenly. "It's not a real commission yet. It's a petition." "I'd love to," I said. It felt like overreaching, like walking onto a beam you haven't tested, but the beam held. Her apartment smelled like pencil shavings and basil. She had a table covered in chipboard and foam core and those little tree models that always look like they belong in a patient's dream. The library was modest and right, a long reading room that faced a courtyard. Windows tall enough to forgive anyone who looked through them. "This is beautiful," I said, and meant it with the relief you feel when you realize there are still people whose first language is care. We didn't kiss. I shook her hand again, like a man leaving a meeting that mattered. In the elevator going up to my place, I thought of Aunt Elaine and built something that lasts, and the sentence lifted itself out of its concrete meanings and into the air where rooms are. I slept that night with the windows open and the ceiling fan on low, and the sense that nothing had been solved and everything had been begun. In the morning, I made a list because that is what you do when you feel a new shape of hope and don't yet know where it fits on your plan. Call Rita about foundation board. Email Evelyn about library daylighting ideas. Order new measuring tapes because all my old ones smell like the house I sold. Drop Kendra's check at the bank straight into the foundation account. Buy yogurt. Evelyn's influence already. Apparently, at the bank, the teller looked at the amount on the check and the account name, the Elaine Hartley Foundation, and said, "Would you like a receipt?" I said yes, even though I knew I would keep the moment better than paper keeps ink. I walked home the long way to pass the library that exists and the library that might. The existing library is good in the way a government building is good when it survives decades. It has a mural that tries to include every story and ends up looking like a crowded bus. I watched a man my age hold the door for a girl with a backpack shaped like a fox and thought about how rooms do what people don't. They hold open without being asked. Back at the loft, I took out the old stone path plan for the backyard and traced the curve with my finger like a man saying goodbye to a letter he'll never mail. It is a marvel we get to love what we later have to leave. It is a marvel we survive it. Evelyn texted a picture of her model library on the table with morning light like water on it. "Do you like the clerestory or should I lower the ceiling and bounce light?" she wrote. "Clerestory." I wrote back, "Let the room remember the sky." She sent a thumbs up and then, after a beat, coffee later, "Yes," I wrote, and opened my calendar like a window. The first lesson you learn in court-adjacent life is that the fight rarely happens in the room where everyone is dressed for it. It happens in the days before, in envelopes and emails, in binders with tabs that mean more than they look like they do. The Sunday night before the emergency hearing, I ironed a shirt I could have worn to a client presentation and set 2 pens in my jacket pocket, one that writes like forgiveness, one that writes like a boundary. I slept 4 hours on purpose, just enough to be sharp, not enough to wander into dreams where someone hands you back the thing they took and you wake up with both relief and loss. At 7:15 a.m., the courthouse was already teaching its daily lesson, the specific quiet that gathers where strangers bring their wreckage to the same room. On the steps, a man in a blue suit rehearsed a speech into a phone and then looked up like he'd been caught cheating on hope. Inside, the air smelled like paper and distrust. Thomas met me by the security line. He nodded at my tie the way a coach nods at a player's shoelaces. Not praise assessment. "Barnes asked for a small conference before we go on the record." He said, "Small conferences are where big decisions go to see if they can be born alive." I said. He smiled without showing teeth. "Let him talk first," he said. We sat in a private consultation room with a glass wall that made privacy feel like theater. Barnes arrived with Kendra half a step behind, as if distance were an accessory she could put on and take off in the hallway. She was in a grey dress that looked like it had been purchased for the day, an apology sewn into the hem. Barnes opened a folder. "My client wishes to avoid unnecessary spectacle," he said. "Which is lawyer, for we have seen the math and will not be betting the house on a 12% chance. She proposes a straightforward division of remaining marital assets. She will relinquish any claim to the inheritance and will not contest the trust structure. In return, there will be no further action on allegations of attempted transfers. Thomas didn't look at me. That was our rhythm. He'd already heard my answer the day I said clean is better. We have a counter on paper, he said, sliding our agreement across the table. Return half of what was moved from the joint accounts in full within 24 hours. Execute a non-disclosure to protect our client from future reputational harm. He will forego any civil action related to the trust attempts. Barnes didn't blink, which meant he'd expected those terms. He scanned the pages, leaned close to Kendra, whispered. She kept her eyes on the paper the way a child stares at a math test they should have studied for. We accept, he said, with one clarification on the payment method: cashier's check. No later than Kobe tomorrow. Done. Thomas said. Done, Kendra said, and in her voice I heard a door that wasn't latched properly swing shut on a windy night. That should have been the end of it. And functionally, it was. But endings are rarely where they belong in stories like this. They arrive in pieces, in a series of small closures that add up to an unremarkable. Crucial silence. We signed, we exchanged copies, we walked out into the hall and into a different weather system. Kendra stopped me 2 steps from the elevator. Do you really think it was never about the money, she asked, as if asking would retroactively fix the part of the past where she tried to make it be. I think you thought it had to be. I said, that's different. You think you didn't do anything wrong, she said. No, I said, I think I stopped doing anything wrong when I finally believed what you were showing me. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. I didn't. She looked like she wanted to say a line she'd underlined the night before. Nothing came. The doors closed, and with them the era where my heart waited for a different scene to play. Thomas and I stood by the window and watched a slow rain start like a courthouse sighing. You kept your word to yourself, he said. I kept hers, I said, surprised to hear it. My aunts built something that lasts. He nodded. You built a wall in the right place, he said, and you built a door too. Doors are for the person you become. I said, exactly, he said. Go be him. Outside, the rain made the city smell like pennies and river. I walked, because walking is how thoughts decide their final form. At a light, a boy in a yellow raincoat with a dinosaur on the hood told his mother he liked storms because they made the world honest. All the secrets wash out, he said. She laughed too quickly. The boy glanced up at me, as if to check whether an adult stranger knew what he meant. I do, I said, not out loud. When I got home, I put the settlement copy in a drawer and took it out and put it away again 3 times. Then I made tea in a pot I never used when life was a 2-person calendar. It tasted like heat and patience. That afternoon, Evelyn texted. They approved our community workshop for the library model. 2 weeks. If 10 people show up, I'll call it a win. 11, I wrote. I'll make one. She sent a sticker of a library card and a cartoon book with legs. It felt ridiculous in exactly the right measure. I looked out the window at the soaked brick and knew 2 things with equal certainty. I was sad in a way that would take time to spend, and I was relieved in a way that would allow me to keep earning what came next. The cashier's check arrived on a Tuesday in an envelope that looked like all the other mail, which is how important things prefer to travel. I took it to the bank with the kind of ceremonial plainness that fits the moment best. No fanfare, no anything. The teller, Amber, according to her name tag, looked at the amount, looked at me, looked back at the amount the way you look at a steep hill you know you can climb but would rather have done yesterday. Deposit to which account, she asked. The Elaine Hartley Foundation, I said. Please. She typed. Do you want to keep the envelope? No, I said. And then, yes. I didn't know why until later, when I put it in a box of things I keep to prove to myself that choices were made, not magic performed. On the way out, a woman in scrubs with a lanyard that said Esto Josephs leaned over a stroller and whispered nonsense to a baby who took it like a serious briefing. In the parking lot, an older man in a military cap helped a lady wrestle a package into the trunk of a sedan with a dent that had been earned long ago. There is a churchiness to banks when you're depositing something from a life you survived. Everyone looks like a congregation that knows the hymn. I went to the lot where the Victory Drive house used to be mine and wasn't anymore. I parked across the street because that's what you do when you're visiting a memory and don't want to spook it. The twins were out front with sidewalk chalk, their masterpieces reckless in color and proportion, a blue dog with wings, a sun that had decided to be green today, a house that looked enough like the house to make me laugh. Their mother waved, I waved back. The stone path I'd laid curved as well as it had ever curved. The hydrangeas were bigger than when we left them, as if the shrubs had taken on a responsibility they hadn't asked for but carried anyway. I thought about straight lines and curves, about how certainty is a necessary material but insufficient for a life. You need a few turns that make you slow down and notice the sky doesn't end where you thought it did. That afternoon, I met Evelyn at the model shop she used when clients had budgets that allowed for tiny trees. We spread chipboard and cut foam and argued amiably about whether the children's reading room should face east for morning light or north for the even kind of illumination that gives eyes a rest. 3 teenagers wandered in a field trip that had wandered off course. Evelyn handed them knives like trust and said, "Cut me 3 benches that look like they're waiting for love to sit down." They did. One of the boys cut his crooked and apologized. "Benches are where crooked gets forgiven," she said. He smiled like a kid who had never heard an adult make grammar that friendly. After they left, I asked, "What made you pick public buildings?" "My mother is a nurse," she said. "My dad taught high school English. They thought the best we could make was rooms where tired people get lighter. If the walls don't do that, they aren't finished yet. My dad used to say, my aunt was a nurse," I said. She left me the means to build something that keeps breathing without her. We stood too close to say more without saying too much. She touched the edge of the model with one finger, the way you touch a friend's sleeve when you want to hug them, but the room is still a room. "Coffee," she said. "Yes," I said, which had become a habit I was enjoying. The cafe had a chalkboard with a misspelled quote about kindness. Ease. The barista had a tattoo of a lighthouse that was better drawn than the logo on their cups. We talked about chair heights and the moral geometry of stairs. I told her about the scholarship ceremony and the girl in the blue dress. She told me about a clinic she designed where the waiting room had windows low enough that children could see outside without climbing onto a lap. Architecture is teaching people to stand where they can see the next piece of their life. She said, and sometimes it's convincing yourself you can still do that for you. I said. We sat in the corner by a plant that had learned to suffer beautifully. The cafe door opened and closed and opened again. Like a breath, I realized I had made it through an entire day without picturing Kendra on a balcony with a man whose body bent toward her like devotion. I realized I had done that the day before. 2. The mind notices its own weather only after the front moves through. Evelyn looked at my hands. "You took your ring off at a smart time." She said. "I didn't check the almanac." I said. "I just woke up and it felt like metal. Metal can be heavy in the wrong story." She said. "What's the right story?" I asked. "The one you're building when you aren't trying to build the one someone else would like to live in." She said. "Fair." I said. We finished our coffee slowly. The way you finish a paragraph you know you'll quote later. That night, alone in the loft, I unrolled a set of plans for a small community pavilion. A neighborhood association had asked me to consult on pro bono. The budget was mostly sweat and bake sale. I drew a porch long, low, with shade that reached greedily into the afternoon because what most American neighborhoods need is a stage for being a neighbor. I put a line on the plan that would read like a joke to anyone who didn't know the history in my hand pathway. Slight curve. I smiled like a man sneaking grace into a speck. I slept without a fan and dreamed of a hallway with no doors and woke up with my heart sprinting. I stood at the window until the room remembered me. Sometimes healing looks like a man holding onto a sill and telling the morning, I'm not a fall. A year is an honest unit. It will not be sped up or slowed down by your wishes. You get the same allotment as anyone else. And within it, your life either finds shape or admits it needs renovation. In the first year after the courthouse morning, I built rooms. Not just for clients, though there were those. Two, but for myself, which is a sentence I would have embarrassed myself by saying 20 years ago. Some rooms were literal, some were the kind you built by ritual. We rented a tiny space over a bakery that smelled like buttered childhood. Rita sat on our board, along with a high school counselor and a structural engineer who named every beam like a pet. We set criteria that valued grit more than grades, essays more than applications. We awarded 4 scholarships that first year. Every time a check cleared, I wrote Aunt Elaine's name at the bottom of a page in a notebook and underlined it twice. Evelyn's model drew a motley crew retired teachers, teenagers with black nail polish, a pastor who made maple syrup in his backyard, a woman who ran a daycare off her porch, a carpenter who cried when he talked about the school where his shop class had been cut. We placed the model in the center of a pushed-together group of folding tables and asked everybody to move walls with their hands and say why. I want my grandson to have a place to sit where the loud isn't, one woman said, which is perfect brief language. When the evening ended, the teenagers hung back to photograph the model like it was a band they loved before everyone else did. City Council didn't fund the library that year. They did the next. Rooms often get built a year late for the right reason. I walked by the Victory Drive house every few weeks, like a man checking the health of a promise he no longer had to keep. The twins got taller. The hydrangeas committed to being blue no matter what. Once, the girl yelled, "We have a dog now," and the dog barked to confirm his existence. I waved and kept moving, pleased to be a character who appears irregularly in a good story that isn't mine. Evelyn and I started a tradition you would mock if you were young and in a hurry. Sunday dinners that were simple and predictable. Roast chicken, big bowl of greens, bread worthy of butter. We invited people who needed a place to tell a story they'd been sitting on. A nurse described holding a hand in the dark. A substitute teacher told us about a boy who wrote his name for the first time with a pencil like a wand. A contractor choked up describing the day a foundation inspector said the words plumb and true after everyone left. We did dishes in the sink and wrapped leftovers and stood comically close at the cabinet too small for two. It doesn't take much to make an ordinary room holy. It takes repetition and the belief that what you put on the table is a pledge. I kept my appointment with the water. Once a week, if the weather allowed, I sat and watched ships, if you watch long enough. Every ship looks like one you saw on a different day in a different mood. I let the river teach me times say how it holds everything without needing your opinion. On quiet afternoons, I'd see a wedding party take photos on the steps nearby. You can be bitter about that if you like. I recommend deciding not to be in that same year. Kendra texted me twice. The first time I heard about the foundation, that was always more you than it was me. Good luck. The second time, Phoenix is hot in August. Lesson learned. I didn't reply to either. Not out of cruelty, out of a respect for the absence that had earned its stay. Once, a mutual friend mentioned she'd moved on again. a different city with a different skyline. I wished her no harm and did not waste a minute imagining her balcony view. I did see Jason one more time, this time from across a room at a fundraising gala where both of us, it seems, had learned the choreography of generosity as an event. He was flanked by women with the hair of the righteous, laughing in a way that made me tired. Our eyes didn't meet. Or maybe they did in the way a crossword answer meets a clue briefly, then gone. I also spent time answering unasked questions. People love to ask about betrayal because story is an instrument they can hear themselves in. But what they mean, most of the time, is what do I do with the fear that it could happen to me? The answer that is true and unsexy is this: you build systems that are strong enough to help you stay kind when someone else has forgotten how. You maintain paper trails not because you distrust, but because you respect the complexity of a life where money and love share a kitchen. You talk about boundaries when you are happy, so that when you are not, the boundaries already know their job. You don't commingle what shouldn't be commingled. Not because you're planning to leave, because you're planning to stay. And staying requires foundations that don't crumble when a hard wind leans in. One night, after a long day on a site where a developer wanted windows to be cheaper and we wanted daylight to be honest, I asked Evelyn if she believed in revenge in any form that could be good. Revenge is a hallway with mirrors, she said. You end up walking past yourself 100 times and not liking any of the reflections. What's the opposite? I asked. Service, she said, then smirked at herself, which is such a nurse's daughter thing to say. It's also an architect's deepest wish when you scrape off all the talk. I said. We went for a walk through the quiet side streets where the houses sit like grandparents who've seen everything and learned to wait before speaking somewhere. A radio played a song that once hurt and didn't anymore. I made a list in my head of every space I'd been in that had made me better simply by insisting. It was longer than my sadness.